The gallery of Courtroom 7 of the Harrington County Superior Court is full, and Elena Voss-Harrington sits completely, devastatingly alone. Her chair on the plaintiff's side of the long oak table is surrounded by empty seats. No attorney sits beside her. No advisor leans to whisper in her ear. No hand rests on her shoulder. The space around her has the particular cruelty of absence, the kind that announces itself loudly to every person watching. She sits with her hands folded on the table. Still, precise. The single gold bangle on her wrist catches the cold fluorescent light and holds it. Across the aisle, barely 12 feet away and feeling like a different world, Darian Harrington has 5 people seated beside and behind him. His lead attorney, Caroline Ames, is already arranging documents with the confident efficiency of someone who has already decided the outcome. 2 junior associates flank her. Behind Darian, 2 business partners in expensive suits lean forward with the casual ease of men who believe this is merely a formality. Darian himself is turned sideways in his chair, speaking to one of his partners, his laughter low and deliberate. Performed laughter. The kind calibrated to carry exactly far enough. It carries to Elena. She does not flinch. Caroline Ames rises from her chair, smooths her pewter jacket, and allows her gaze to travel across the aisle with theatrical slowness. She looks at Elena, alone, without counsel, without support, and permits herself a small, contemptuous smile. She leans toward Darian and murmurs something. Darian glances at Elena. His smile does not reach his gray eyes. Nothing genuine ever does. She came alone, he murmurs back, as though this is a curiosity, as though a woman arriving to a courtroom without armor is a remarkable and slightly amusing thing. In the gallery, whispers begin like water finding cracks. Did she not bring a lawyer? Who does she think she is? She doesn't stand a chance. Elena hears all of it. She unfolds her hands, refolds them, breathes once, slow, measured, deliberate. Her amber eyes are fixed on the empty bench where Judge Hollis will soon sit. She is not looking at Darian. She does not need to. The sharp crack of a gavel. The rustle of the gallery rising. Judge Hollis enters with the measured authority of someone who has seen every variety of human theater this room has to offer. Please be seated. The room settles. Judge Hollis arranges her materials with quiet precision, peers over her reading glasses at both tables, and pauses on Elena's side with a nearly imperceptible flicker of something. Concern, perhaps, or recognition of a familiar kind of loneliness. Miss Voss-Harrington, she says carefully, the court notes that you are representing yourself today. Is that correct? Elena rises. Smooth. Unhurried. That is correct, Your Honor. A sound moves through the gallery, not quite laughter, something more corrosive than laughter. The soft, collective exhale of people who have already decided the story. Caroline Ames is on her feet immediately. Your Honor, if I may, my client is prepared to address the matter of the Harrington Voss real estate holdings, the wrongful appropriation of the Harrington brothers' business assets, and you will have your opportunity, Miss Ames, Judge Hollis says, precisely clipping the interruption. But the damage of the interruption was never about the words. It was about the posture. Caroline Ames turned to look at Elena when she spoke that phrase, wrongful appropriation, and she held Elena's gaze with the specific contempt of a woman who knows she is the only adult in the room with a weapon. Elena sat back down. And then it began. The morning session of testimony was, by any objective measure, a systematic public dismantling. Darian's business partner, a man named Gregory Kells, took the witness stand first. He was polished, camera-ready, and utterly comfortable in the role of credible witness. He spoke about the Harrington Brothers Real Estate Development Company, the company that Darian had built, he said, with his own vision, his own relationships, his own risk. The fact that the company bore both brothers' names, Harrington and Harrington Development, was referenced once, lightly, and then moved past with the practiced ease of someone skating over thin ice. He spoke of Elena's involvement in company finances as interference. He described her access to business accounts as overreach. He used words like unstable and emotionally reactive and manipulative in the smooth, regretful tone of a man performing reluctant honesty. Elena sat quietly through all of it. She did not object. She did not shift in her seat. She wrote 4 words on the legal pad in front of her and then set her pen down. Those 4 words, let them reveal themselves. When Caroline Ames rose for her direct examination, she moved toward the center of the room with the particular energy of a woman who feeds on audiences. "Mrs. Harrington," she began. "Miss Voss-Harrington," Elena said from her seat. Quietly, without heat, a beat of silence. "Miss Voss-Harrington," Caroline repeated, with a smile that did not belong on a human face. "Can you point to a single person in this courtroom today who supports your claim? A single colleague, a single legal representative, a single family member who has vouched for you or stood beside you in this proceeding?" The question was not a legal question. It was a cruelty dressed as one. And the gallery, God help them, leaned forward. Elena looked at Caroline Ames for a long, measured moment. "I can point to the truth," she said. "I find that more useful." Polite laughter, surprised laughter, rippled briefly through the gallery before dying. It was not enough to change the temperature of the room. Caroline Ames smiled like a woman who had heard better. Darian, behind his table, leaned back in his chair with the satisfied ease of a man watching a foregone conclusion unfold on schedule. He straightened his burgundy pocket square. He whispered something to one of his partners, and they both smiled. A woman in the gallery, older, well-dressed, leaned toward her companion and said, not quietly enough, "She has no one." 3 words. Simple, devastating, wrong. But Elena heard them, and she let them land, and she held them in her chest like kindling. Because she knew what was coming. And she had decided, long ago, that when the fire arrived, it would arrive at exactly the right moment. A brief recess. The courtroom empties partially. The sound of low conversation, the clinking of water glasses, the distant hum of a city outside old stone walls. What no one in that courtroom understood, what Darian Harrington in his magnificent arrogance had never bothered to investigate, was the particular and formidable history of the woman he had chosen to humiliate in public. Elena Reeve Voss had not always been Elena Harrington. She had been, for the first 26 years of her life, the only daughter of Senator Elias Voss, 17-year veteran of the United States Senate, former chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and the eldest son of Margaret Voss, Pemberton, whose family name was carved into the cornerstone of 3 university buildings and 2 federal courthouses in this very state. The Voss family did not make noise. That was the thing that Darian had miscalculated so catastrophically, and in fairness, it was an easy mistake to make if you were the kind of man who measured power by how loudly it announced itself. The Voss family made decisions. Elena had met Darian at a charity gala 7 years ago. He was charming, architecturally handsome, and possessed of the specific magnetism of a man who had built something from ambition alone. She had been drawn to that, the rawness of his drive, the fire in someone who had not been handed his life the way she had partially been handed hers. Her father had concerns from the beginning. He had been measured and precise about them, as he was about everything. "Elena," he had said, in the quiet of his study in their Georgetown home, "I am not asking you to distrust him. I am asking you to keep your eyes open." Men who have never had security often cannot resist consuming the security of others. She had not listened. She had loved Darian instead. And, for 3 years, the love had been real enough to be worth loving. She had quietly, deliberately kept her family background out of their social world. Not out of shame, out of self-preservation. She had watched, from girlhood, what happened to relationships built in the shadow of the Voss name, how they bent toward the name and not toward the person. She wanted Darian to love Elena, not Elena Voss. She should have known that a man incapable of distinguishing between those two things would never truly love either. When Darian began what Victor, his own brother, his partner, would later call the systematic dismantling, Elena had understood it before Victor did. She had watched the accounting irregularities accumulate. She had seen assets quietly restructured. She had watched Darian isolate Victor from investors, from bankers, from the relationships that kept Harrington and Harrington viable. And she had done something that surprised even her father. She had not called home. She had not asked Senator Elias Voss to make a phone call. She had not asked Margaret Voss to deploy the quiet, devastating machinery of old family influence. She had not asked for any of the considerable weapons her bloodline could have placed in her hands. Instead, she had spent 8 months building a case from the inside. She had documented everything. She had photographed documents. She had preserved financial records on encrypted drives stored in 3 separate locations. She had approached Victor quietly, carefully, and helped him understand what was being taken from him. She had done it entirely alone. But she had not done it without a plan. 3 weeks before today's hearing, Elena had made one phone call, not to her father's office, not to the family attorney. She had called her grandmother. "Grandma," she had said, "I need you to trust my timing." Margaret Voss had been silent for exactly 4 seconds. "Elena Reeve Voss," she had said finally, "I have been waiting 6 years, 4 months, and approximately 16 days for this conversation. Tell me what you need and when you need it." "I need you to arrive," Elena had said, "when I tell you to. Not before, not a minute earlier. I need him to believe he has won completely." Another silence. "You want him to celebrate before the verdict," her grandmother had said. "I want him to show everyone exactly who he is," Elena said, "before anyone stops him." And Margaret Voss, the woman who had survived 3 recessions, 1 presidential administration that had specifically targeted her family's interests, and 51 years of a marriage to a man she had loved with her whole heart and buried with her whole grief, had said simply, "Then we will arrive when you call us, my darling. And we will arrive fully." Elena had exhaled then, the first truly clean breath she had taken in years. "Thank you," she whispered. "Save your thanks," Margaret had said. "Save it for after." The sharp crack of the gavel calling the room back to order, the shuffle of feet, the room settling back into its positions like actors resuming a play. The afternoon session opened with a shift in temperature that only Elena seemed to notice. It was subtle. Almost nothing. The way the afternoon light had changed slightly through the high arched windows, gone from cold and flat to something with more weight in it, more amber, more gravity. The way the old marble of the lobby floor outside had begun to carry the distant sound of purposeful footsteps. But the footsteps stopped. Not yet. Inside the courtroom, Darian Harrington was reaching the apex of his confidence. Caroline Ames had called him to offer supporting testimony, and he settled into the witness stand with the ease of a man who has rehearsed his performance so many times that he has mistaken it for truth. He spoke beautifully. He always did. He spoke of building Harrington and Harrington from nothing, from a single property deal and a rented office. He spoke of his brother Victor with carefully calibrated sympathy, the kind that implies the sympathy is an act of generosity towards someone lesser. He described Elena's involvement in business records as the well-meaning but damaging interference of a woman who did not fully understand the complexity of what they were building. The gallery absorbed every word. Elena wrote 2 more words on her legal pad. Almost time. Her phone, placed face down on the table beside her water glass, had vibrated once, briefly, 12 minutes ago. She had not looked at it in the courtroom. She did not need to read the message. She knew what it said. "We are here." She turned the phone over, read the 2 words, placed it face down again. She breathed. In the gallery, among the journalists and the curious and the people who had come to watch what they believed would be a swift and satisfying defeat of a woman with no weapons. A single reporter, a young woman from the Chronicle with a practiced eye for the things that happen before things happen, was watching Elena, not Darian, not Caroline Ames and her commanding performance. Elena. And the young reporter noticed something that she would write about 3 days later in a piece that went quietly, powerfully viral. She wrote, "The woman at the plaintiff's table never looked afraid." She looked like someone who had already read the last page of the book and was waiting, with extraordinary patience, for everyone else to catch up. Darian stepped down from the witness stand with a barely concealed satisfaction. He passed Elena's table without looking at her, a deliberate theatrical snub, and settled back into his chair. He straightened his pocket square. He leaned toward Caroline and said, barely below audible, "She's done." Caroline smiled. Across the aisle, Elena lifted her eyes from her legal pad. She looked at the door, the great carved wooden door at the back of Courtroom 7, and for the first time that day, the very first time, she allowed herself the smallest, most private, most devastating smile. Then she looked away. She picked up her pen. She was ready. The quiet that falls when a room believes a verdict has already been reached. The particular heavy silence of foregone conclusions. Caroline Ames rose for what was clearly intended as her closing statement, or something close enough to one that had functioned as a public execution. She stood at the center of the room. She did not look at Judge Hollis. She looked at Elena. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the rich, unhurried confidence of absolute certainty, "what this court has before it today is a straightforward matter of record. The plaintiff, Elena Voss-Harrington, has arrived before this court without legal representation, without supporting witnesses, without a single character reference, without professional advocacy of any kind." She paused. Let that land. "She has arrived," Caroline continued, "essentially alone. In a matter of this magnitude, involving the fraudulent transfer of business assets worth in excess of $11 million, she stands before this court as the single voice in her own defense." Another pause. This one was longer. This one was designed to make everyone in the gallery look at Elena, really look at her, and see precisely how small a single woman looks at a table built for 5. And they did look. And Elena, because she had decided a long time ago exactly how she would receive this moment, sat very still. Her hands were folded, her eyes were clear. Her breathing was even. But the bangle on her wrist, her grandmother's bangle, she pressed her right thumb against it, gently, the way a person presses a bruise to remember they are still alive. In the gallery, someone coughed. Someone shifted. The young journalist was writing with rapid strokes. Victor Harrington, seated in the third row of the gallery, looked at his hands. He had not been called as a witness yet. He was the most important witness in this room, and he had not yet been allowed to speak, and the weight of that was visible in every line of his face. He looked like a man drowning in slow motion. "This court," Caroline Ames said, building now towards something theatrical, "must consider what it means that a plaintiff with a claim of this magnitude could not secure a single ally, a single counsel, a single advocate. What does that tell us about the merit of the claim?" She spread her hands. "It tells us everything." The gallery murmured. Judge Hollis's face was carefully, perfectly neutral, but her fingers had stilled on her pen. Elena looked down at her notepad. She looked at the 4 words she had written hours ago. Let them reveal themselves. They had. Magnificently. Completely. Every dismissal, every smirk, every performed sigh of contemptuous pity, every murmur from the gallery. Every word that Caroline Ames had just delivered with the confidence of a woman who had not yet understood what she was walking into. All of it. Recorded, witnessed, and soon to be answered. Elena uncapped her pen. She wrote one final note. Now. She reached for her phone under the table. She typed a single letter to a number she had memorized before she could drive a car. G. For go. She placed the phone face down. She waited. And then, from somewhere beyond the great carved wooden door at the back of Courtroom 7, she heard it. The sound that had shaped her childhood. The deliberate, rhythmic, unmistakable sound of an ebony cane on marble floor. Click, click, click. Elena Voss-Harrington closed her eyes, just for 1 second. She smiled. The first sound was the cane. No one in the gallery immediately understood what they were hearing. It was simply sound, a rhythm from beyond the door, measured and steady and somehow deeply, almost biologically authoritative. The kind of sound that makes the back of your neck respond before your mind catches up. Then the door opened. It opened with the unhurried certainty of something that was always going to open, not flung wide, not dramatized. Opened fully with quiet deliberateness, as though whoever stood behind it had no concept of the world as a place that required them to rush or justify or explain themselves. Margaret Voss entered Courtroom 7. She was 5 feet 4 inches of absolute, concentrated authority wrapped in midnight blue Chanel. She did not shuffle. She did not rush. She walked with the measured, deliberate precision of a woman who had long ago learned that the pace you choose in a room tells everyone everything they need to know about how much you fear them. She feared no one in this room. Her white hair was swept into its perfect French roll. Her pearl strand lay at her throat, 3 rows of them, natural, luminous. Her ebony cane struck the marble, click, 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 and every head in the gallery turned as though responding to a conductor's downbeat. She moved down the center aisle, her Baltic amber eyes. Elena's eyes, older, fiercer, tempered by 7 decades of refusing to be underestimated, swept the room once. Once was enough. She took in Caroline Ames. She took in the gallery. She took in the defendant's table with its 5 expensive suits and its supreme unearned confidence. And then she found Elena. And something moved across that ancient, magnificent face, not sentimentality, not maternal softness, but something far more powerful than both. Pride. The marrow-deep, unshakable pride of a woman recognizing her own bloodline, standing exactly where it belongs. But Margaret Voss was not alone. Because 3 steps behind her, and the gallery began to register this now, the sound shifting, the murmur beginning as individual comprehension flickered to life across a dozen faces. 3 steps behind her walked Senator Elias Voss. 6 feet 2 inches. Silver hair. The American flag pin on his lapel. He walked with the unhurried authority of a man who has learned that walking into a room slowly is the most powerful entrance of all. His eyes were dark and level, and they did not waver. They found his daughter at the plaintiff's table, and something in his jaw tightened, not with grief, but with the specific quiet fury of a father who has watched his child be hurt in slow motion for years and has finally been given permission to respond. He was still in his Senate session suit. He had come directly. He had not stopped to change. He had not stopped at all. And behind him, the gallery broke. Not loudly, not in a burst. It broke in the way that certainty breaks, in pieces, each piece landing separately as individual recognition hit individual people. Because behind Senator Voss walked 4 additional figures: the Voss family attorney, renowned litigator James Pemberton Cole, carrying a leather briefcase that had the dense, settled weight of documentation; beside him, a woman Elena's age, whom the court reporters would later identify as senior financial investigator Renata Cross of the Federal Forensic Accounting Division; behind them, 2 additional legal associates, young and precise and carrying matching document portfolios. And last through the door, quiet and unhurried, and looking as though he had been waiting years for precisely this threshold, Victor Harrington, not seated in the gallery this time, walking in, walking forward His dark eyes found his brother across the room, and a decade of grief and rage and exhausted hope settled into something that was not quite peace, but was much closer to it than he had felt in years. The gallery had gone from murmur to silence. The silence was extraordinary. It was the silence of a room that has just realized it was watching an entirely different story than the one it came to see. Caroline Ames had stopped speaking. She stood at the center of the room with her arms at her sides, and the color was draining from her face in real time, and she was performing the rapid, terrible calculation of a woman whose entire strategic preparation had just been rendered catastrophically incomplete. Darian Harrington. Let us take a moment with Darian Harrington, because this was the moment. This was the moment. The moment toward which everything in the past 6 years had been building, quietly and with great patience, like water finding its way through stone. Darian Harrington turned in his chair when he heard the cane. He turned slowly, because he was still operating in the reality of 20 seconds ago, where he was winning, where the room was his, where the woman across the aisle was alone and without weapons and about to be publicly, efficiently dismantled. He turned, and he saw Margaret Voss. Something crossed his face that he could not control. A flicker, a fracture, and then his brain supplied the context, and the fracture deepened. He had met Margaret Voss exactly once. A Sunday dinner 3 months into his relationship with Elena, before Elena had gently but firmly redirected their social world away from her family. He remembered the old woman. He had found her slightly intimidating and had told himself it was because she was eccentric. He had not asked who she was. He had not researched the Voss family. He had looked at Elena, warm, private, deliberately unadorned Elena, who wore no family name like a shield, and he had constructed a story about her that fit the space she allowed him. He had never asked about the space she did not. And now, Senator Elias Voss was approaching the bar of Courtroom 7. He did not speak. He did not need to. His attorney, James Pemberton Cole, stepped forward with measured precision. "Your Honor," Pemberton Cole said, his voice the voice of a man who has argued before the Supreme Court and found it adequate preparation, James Pemberton Cole, entering appearance on behalf of the plaintiff, Elena Voss-Harrington, along with co-counsel Dr. Renata Cross, representing as forensic financial expert, and, he turned slightly, indicating the figures entering with him, co-filing parties, Mr. Victor Harrington, and the office of Senator Elias Voss, who requests leave to observe proceedings as a member of the public gallery. Judge Hollis had set down her pen. She looked at Pemberton Cole for a long, still moment. She looked at Senator Voss. She looked at Margaret Voss, who had arrived at the plaintiff's table and was now standing beside Elena's chair, that small, magnificent woman with her ebony cane and her pearls and her amber eyes that had not moved from her granddaughter's face. Margaret Voss placed one hand, light as paper, strong as iron, on Elena's shoulder. Elena looked up at her, and for the first time that day, the very first time, her composure did not hold entirely. Not in a broken way, not in a way that spoke of weakness, but in the way that composure yields when it is no longer necessary to be a shield. Her eyes filled. She blinked once. Her grandmother's hand tightened. "You did this perfectly," Margaret Voss said, in a voice barely above a whisper, low enough for Elena only, though the silence of the room meant it carried. "Perfectly, my darling. Now we finish it." Senator Elias Voss moved to stand behind his daughter. He placed one large hand on the back of her chair. He looked across at Darian Harrington, and the look was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was certain. And Darian Harrington, in his Brioni suit with his burgundy pocket square, surrounded by his business partners and his expensive legal team and everything he had spent 6 years carefully and fraudulently constructing, looked at the man standing behind his ex-wife. And he recognized the flag pin. And something in him went very, very still. Because the woman he had dismissed as alone, as weaponless, as powerless, the woman he had publicly humiliated in front of a room full of witnesses today, was the daughter of a sitting United States senator and the granddaughter of a woman whose family name was carved into the cornerstone of the courthouse they were currently standing in. She had always been that. She had simply chosen when to say so. Judge Hollis cleared her throat. "Mr. Pemberton Cole," she said, with the measured neutrality that masked what those in the gallery would later describe as barely contained astonishment. "The court welcomes your appearance. We will recess for 15 minutes to allow the plaintiff's newly entered counsel to organize." She looked across the room. "Both parties, please be prepared to proceed fully." Her gavel came down, and in the 15 seconds of stunned, reverberating, magnificent silence that followed, before the gallery erupted, before Caroline Ames reached for her phone with shaking hands, before Darian Harrington's business partners began making quiet, rapid, extremely different calculations about whose side they wanted to be on, in those 15 seconds, Elena Voss-Harrington looked at her grandmother. And she smiled, not the small, private, contained smile of strategy. Something real, something full, something that had been waiting a very long time to exist in this room. The recess, hushed, furious conversations, the sound of phones being consulted desperately, the rustle of documents being reconsidered. The 15-minute recess was, for Darian Harrington, 15 minutes of accelerating catastrophe. His business partners, the two men in expensive suits who had been leaning forward with the casual ease of spectators at a performance they were certain of, were no longer leaning forward. They were standing in the far corner of the gallery with their phones pressed to their ears. Their body language had undergone a rapid, humiliating transformation from confident allies to men conducting rapid damage assessment on their own positions. One of them, the older one, Kells, was already on his second call. His voice, when it drifted to Caroline Ames, was not the voice of a loyal colleague. It was the voice of a man recalculating his exposure. Caroline Ames herself was at a small conference table in the anteroom, and the image of her there, papers spread, phone in one hand, pen in the other. A fine line of color high on her cheekbones was not the image of a lawyer in control of her case. It was the image of a woman who had just realized she had been expertly, completely, and irreversibly outmaneuvered. Because James Pemberton Cole had handed the court clerk 6 manila folders before the recess. 6 folders, each one bearing the gold-embossed letterhead of Pemberton, Cole and Associates. Each one, they would discover, containing a tier of the case that Elena had been building quietly, methodically, for the better part of a year. Financial forensic analysis by Dr. Renata Cross, documenting with clinical precision the systematic transfer of Harrington and Harrington assets into shell accounts linked solely to Darian's interests. Email records, transaction histories, and, most devastatingly, a deposition taken 3 weeks prior from a former accountant of Harrington and Harrington who had been promised confidentiality and had, upon receiving it, described in granular detail the instructions he had received from Darian regarding the restructuring of assets away from Victor's ownership stake. Elena had not come to court today unprepared. She had come to court today without showing her preparation. There is a difference. When the recess ended and the court reconvened, Darian Harrington returned to his seat. He walked back in with the particular gait of a man who is performing composure while composure is deserting him entirely. He sat down. He looked across at the plaintiff's table. Elena sat there now, flanked by counsel. Victor sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind her, and for the first time in years he was sitting upright. For the first time in years his face held something other than exhaustion. Senator Voss sat in the gallery, and the flag pin on his lapel caught the light. Margaret Voss sat beside her son, her cane resting against the bench, her eyes on the proceedings with the serenity of a woman who has already read the verdict. And Darian looked at all of it, at the room that had, 30 minutes ago, been entirely his, and the full catastrophic understanding of what he had done began to assemble itself inside him. Not just today. Not just this case. He had looked at Elena Voss, and he had seen a woman. He had not bothered to see the rest. He had never asked about her family. He had never researched her background. He had spent 6 years in proximity to the daughter of a United States senator and the granddaughter of the Voss-Pemberton bloodline, and he had never known it because Elena had never offered it, and he had never thought to ask. Because the specific arrogance of a man like Darian Harrington is the belief that a woman is exactly and only what she presents to him. She had been so much more. She had always been so much more. When Judge Hollis asked if the defense was prepared to respond to the forensic financial analysis submitted by the plaintiff's newly entered counsel, Caroline Ames asked for a continuance. The request was denied. Darian Harrington, for the first time in this room, looked very small late afternoon. The filtered gold light through the high windows of Courtroom 7 has shifted fully to amber, the kind that arrives at the end of things, or the beginning of them, depending on where you are standing. 3 weeks later, the judgment was entered. Full restoration of Victor Harrington's ownership stake and business assets. Financial damages assessed against Darian Harrington, piercing the corporate structures through which he had attempted to conceal the transfers. Legal costs awarded to the plaintiff. A referral to the district attorney's office for review of potential fraud charges, a referral that, 6 months later, would result in an indictment. Caroline Ames withdrew from practice in this jurisdiction. Darian's business partners, one by one, distanced themselves with the quiet, rapid efficiency of men who have entirely no loyalty except to survival. The company Darian had tried to consume, the company built by two brothers on ambition and trust, was restored. And Victor Harrington, for the first time in 3 years, was able to breathe. On the steps of the courthouse on the afternoon the judgment was read, Elena Voss-Harrington stood in the November light with her grandmother's hand through her arm and her father beside her, and she breathed the cold air deep into her lungs. "You could have called us sooner," her father said, not as reproach, but as the statement of a man who still wishes he could have spared his child some portion of pain. "I know," Elena said, "but he needed to show everyone exactly who he was, before anyone stopped him. If you had arrived on day one, he would have retreated and renegotiated and reconstructed. He needed to believe he was winning completely." She paused. Arrogance, properly witnessed, is its own confession. Her grandmother made a sound beside her, not quite a laugh, but its architecture. "Your grandmother used to say something," Senator Voss said. "I know what she used to say," Elena replied. Margaret Voss said it anyway, because she had earned the right to say things twice. The most powerful position in a room is the one no one thought to watch. The lesson here is not simply about Elena's victory. It is about what Darian Harrington chose not to see. He looked at a woman, sitting alone, and he saw weakness. He did not see strategy. He did not see bloodline. He did not see the quiet, extraordinary depth of a woman who had chosen to face him on her own terms, in her own time, with her own weapons, and who knew the entire time that when she finally reached for the full weight of everything she came from, it would arrive. Never underestimate someone's hidden support system. Never mistake silence for powerlessness. Never mistake someone's choice to stand alone for an inability to stand otherwise. And now, I need to hear from you, because this story belongs to all of us. Comment below. Have you ever been in a situation where you chose to handle something alone, even when support was available? And why did you make that choice? Second question. What would you have done in Elena's position, called for help immediately, or waited like she did? And finally, who in your life is your Margaret Voss, the person who would show up fully at exactly the right moment? Share your answers below. This community holds every story with the same respect Elena held her own. If this story moved you, and I believe it did, please subscribe to Karma's Heiress, because every week we bring you the stories of women who were underestimated and who answered that underestimation with something far more powerful than rage. They answered with patience, with dignity, with the quiet, devastating certainty of someone who always knew how the story ended. Leave your comment. Share this story. And remember, karma is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives in midnight blue Chanel with a cane on marble. And it is magnificent.